Dr. Stephen Meyer. He received his PhD from the University of Cambridge. He was a former geophysicist, specifically. He's been a college professor, and he's had many, many accolades, been interviewed many times. He's been in the news, been in such films as Expelled with Ben Stein. So many different areas that he's done publications in. New York Times best-selling author, Darwin's Doubt, the explosive origin of animal life and the case for intelligent design, among many others. So we also have the pleasure of having no more oppressive orange orb this time. So you should feel quite in your element. So let's all welcome Dr. Stephen Meyer.
Thank you. Yeah. Still seeing those bright white orbs in the back. I'm a little agnostic about what I'm going to do walking up to the podium here. We're running a little behind schedule, and we had a long session last night with a really constructive discussion with Professor Harden and me, and I was scheduled to talk about why I'm skeptical about theistic evolution, but some of that came out in the discussion last night, and as I was thinking about this, I think it'd be kind of unfair to Jeff for me to give a critique of his position without him not up here, and we had a good exchange last night. So what I thought instead I would do would be to open up the floor for questions about a range of topics related to all the things we've discussed in the conference and other things. And just by way of introduction of myself, so you might have an idea of some things you might want to discuss. I was a professor of philosophy and philosophy of science for 12 years. I had a background, as was mentioned, in science. I'm very interested in, of course, all these origins questions: the origin of the universe, the origin of life, the origin of the Cambrian animals. I've got a trilogy of books on those three topics, with the God hypothesis book that I discussed last night coming out next. And so I'm interested in science. I'm interested in the philosophy of science. But I'm also interested in, more broadly, what you would call apologetics, and how to understand Scripture in light of science. So what I thought I might do is just briefly summarize or amplify a little bit my argument for intelligent design from last night, so you'd have a little bit kind of refresher on what I've been up to. And that might spark some questions, and in fact, it might spark some objections. There are common objections to the theory of intelligent design. One was raised indirectly in an earlier session: is intelligent design science? If I was at Intel yesterday, courtesy of friends who got us connected there, and apparently my invitation there was somewhat controversial, because if you read the Wikipedia page, it says that I'm a proponent of the pseudoscientific idea of intelligent design. So that raises an interesting question and objection. Is intelligent design science? Is it testable? Is it falsifiable? Does it commit a God of the gaps argument, or an argument from ignorance? There are a number of objections that you might want to probe in our discussion. So I thought, with just a brief little bit of introduction about what I call the information problem, or the DNA enigma, then we could just get into question and answers real quickly, and I'd open it up to anything you'd want to discuss. Something that has come up in some informal discussions is the whole question of miracles. Do miracles violate the laws of nature? There's a very old argument from the Enlightenment, from David Hume, that says so. And I've found in teaching freshmen over the years that somehow that perception has gotten into the cultural water, and people just assume that miracles are a violation of the laws of nature, and therefore they can't ever happen. And therefore, if you read the biblical books, they can't possibly be historical. So I'm kind of saying, opening it up to all comers here today. So let me just quickly review and amplify a little bit of the case I was making for intelligent design. And here I'm just going to focus on the biology, which is it's always useful to start with Richard Dawkins, because he frames issues so carefully. He says, biology is a study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. And he affirmed this because he thinks that mutation and natural selection can explain the appearance of design without being guided or directed in any way. That's standard Darwinism from the 19th century that he's brought up to date. And in my work on the origin of life, I've said, well, even if we accept Darwinian evolution, there's a prior question that Darwin didn't address at the base of what he called, or the base of his famous tree of life, which he used to depict the history of life over time. If we think of the branches as all the forms of life at the top, or the branches representing all the forms of life we have today, and that trunk as the one-celled organism from which everything ultimately morphed and changed, Darwin never addressed that question. And as I indicated last night, a key question in modern times that's created a kind of impasse for origin of life studies, in fact a very formidable impasse, is the question of the origin of the information that's stored in the DNA molecule, the structure of which was elucidated by Watson and Crick in 1953. Remember last night I talked a bit about the sequence hypothesis of Francis Crick, the idea that DNA contains information in a digital form that is directing the construction of the crucial protein molecules that keep cells alive and perform all the important tasks, enzymatic catalysis, information processing, and the formation of molecular machines, for example. So we talked about the digital nature of the DNA molecule, and I have a little animation.
In 1957, Francis Crick first proposed that chemicals called bases along the spine of the DNA molecule function as alphabetic characters in a written language or digital characters in a machine code. This animation shows how this digital information directs protein synthesis. First, a large protein complex separates the tightly wound strands of the DNA to prepare it to be copied. During this process of transcription, a protein complex called a polymerase produces a single-stranded copy of the original instructions. Here we see this copy, a messenger RNA molecule, being constructed inside the polymerase as individual bases are positioned and added to the growing strand. Now we see the polymerase in action from the outside as it spits out the messenger RNA transcript. Next, this RNA transcript approaches and passes through a molecular machine called the nuclear pore complex, an information recognition device that controls the flow of information in and out of the cell's nucleus. Now we see the genetic assembly instructions on the messenger RNA approaching and arriving at a two-part chemical factory called a ribosome, the site of protein synthesis. As the messenger RNA transcript passes through the ribosome, the process of translation begins. During translation, a mechanical assembly line builds a specifically sequenced chain of amino acids in accord with the instructions on the transcript. These amino acids are transported from other parts of the cell by molecules called transfer RNAs, which link specific sequences of bases to corresponding amino acids. The sequential arrangement of the amino acids determines the type of protein constructed. When the construction of the chain is complete, it is transported to a barrel-shaped machine that helps fold it into the precise shape required to perform its function. After the chain is folded into a protein, it is released into the outer cytoplasm to do its job in the cell.
And all of this information technology at the foundation of life, I have argued, raises a profound question, an enigma. I call it the DNA enigma. And that is not the structure of the DNA molecule. We now know that thanks to Watson and Crick. It's not where the information in DNA resides, where biological information for building proteins or information for other hereditary traits resides. We know that a lot of that is in the DNA molecule, though there are other epi and ontogenetic sources of information inside cells and animals as well. It's not even what the information does, and the little animation shows that beautifully, how the DNA directs the construction of the proteins at a place called the ribosome. Instead, the DNA enigma is the issue of the origin of that information. And this is where, in our discussion last night with Jeff and me, we did discover a difference. He favors a view of nature that has what he calls mechanistic completeness. I want to argue that systems are mechanistically complete, but in their function, but their origin may point to something outside their system. And this is where I've developed this case for intelligent design based on the information that's present in the biological system. And this is the key question of origin that's been raised by many origin of life researchers. The DNA enigma is, where did the information come from? And the origin of life problem is precisely a problem, therefore, it says Bernd Olaf Kupper is a leading origin of life researcher, of problem of the origin of the information you need to build the proteins that you need to keep cells alive, or to make cellular life possible in the very first place. And if most people here are very familiar with the computer world, and so there's a principle in computer science. If you want to give your computer a new function, you've got to give it new code. And the amazing thing about modern biology is the same thing has been discovered in life. If you want to build a cell, you have to have information to build the proteins to service all the functions that are necessary to keep a cell alive. If you want to build a new form of life from a pre-existing form of life, you need new information. I've written a book about the origin of the first animal life, the Cambrian explosion. And new animals exemplify new body plans. New body plans are unique arrangements of organs and tissues. Organs and tissues require dedicated proteins to service those organs and tissues, and those proteins in turn require new genetic information. So building new forms of animals at least requires new genetic information. So an interesting analog between our biological world and our technological world. Information is running the show and is necessary to function. So what I wanted to do then is talk a little bit about why the information problem is so severe, and then we'll open it up for questions. There's a famous book from the 1960s, late 1960s, at the very tail end of a period of time that historians call the molecular biological revolution. And the book is called Chance and Necessity. It was written by Jacques Monod. He worked closely with Crick. He was a French collaborator on many of the important experiments that actually were crucial in establishing that Crick's sequence hypothesis was right. It was the kind of hypothesis that you couldn't test in the lab with a single crucial experiment. It was a matter of elucidating a whole structure of information processing. And it took a number of years, but Crick turned out to be correct, as best we can tell. And Monod, partly reflecting on this and partly reflecting on the practice of science itself, said the job of the scientist is to explain things by reference to chance or random processes or stochastic processes, all of which would be sort of the same kind of thing, or necessity, by which he meant the laws of nature. If I drop a ball and it falls to the earth, we say the ball is falling by necessity, by the requirements of the laws of physics. Or, he said, you might try to combine the two. And so, not surprisingly, people have tried to explain the origin of information in living systems, or the information necessary to build the first living cell in the origin of life context, by reference to either chance, necessity, or the combination of the two. And oddly, all three approaches have proved deeply and profoundly problematic. The chance approach was very popular in the 1950s. At first, people thought if you gave the molecules in a prebiotic soup enough time, they'd eventually knock into each other and form the information-rich biomolecules. That ran into a whole bunch of problems, but one that I'd like to highlight is one that we can understand by reference to a simple bike clock. It's called a combinatorial problem. If you have a sequence of dials on a a bike lock, you got 4 dials, 10 possibilities at each. You don't have 40 possible combinations, 10 plus 10 plus 10 plus 10. You have 10 times 10 times 10 times 10 times 10 combinations, 10 to the 4th or 10,000 combinations. So if you're trying to find the combination that will open the lock via a random search, the sheer number of possibilities that are going to give you the wrong answer creates an impediment to success to that random search. Now, if you have enough time, of course, you can probably do it if you're a really dedicated thief. But what if you encounter a lock like this? It's got 10 dials. Now, I've done some math on this. If you're a really dedicated thief and you got you want to turn a different dial change the dials every 10 seconds, and you do nothing but that for 100 years, you're still with a lock this big, only going to search about 3% of the total dials. If you do nothing but search, no potty breaks, no meals, no dates, no sleeping, just changing dials, you'll only search 3%. In which case, now if you ask yourself the question, is a random search more likely to succeed or to fail given the available time? The answer is, well, you're overwhelmingly more likely to fail, okay? In which case the chance hypothesis becomes more likely to be false than true. So this is some kind of sophisticated second-order probabilistic reasoning. We don't determine the probability of success of a random search just by knowing how improbable it is to find the thing you're looking for in one try. You need to know what your probabilistic resources are, how many opportunities you have to do the searching. Now, to make a long story short, proteins and DNA molecules are also combinatorial systems. Remember my linking all the snap lock blocks together last night to illustrate a polypeptide chain made of amino acids. If you have a chain of a modest length protein of about 150 amino acids, an average length protein is even a little longer than that, about 300, but just take a modest length protein of about 150. You have 20 different protein forming amino acids that could be part of that linkage. 20 to the 150th power gets you a huge exponential number, a number of combinations that have to be searched. Turns out that there are lots of possible combinations that are functional within that. So to get a real measure of how difficult the search problem is, we not only need to know how many total combinations there are, but how many of them are functional. And research, very important research, has been done on that by now a Biola professor with an endowed chair in molecular biology. He started out at Caltech, did his PhD in chemical engineering and protein science, went on and did a 12-year postdoc at Cambridge University addressing the question, how rare or common are the functional proteins among the space of possible combinations? Okay, so think of it as how many combinations will open the lock versus how many total combinations are there. And with our combination locks, we only have one combination that'll open the lock, and we've got a lot that won't. In proteins, there are a lot that'll open it, but it turns out there are vastly more that won't. So what Professor Axe wanted to know was how many arrangements of amino acids will form a protein fold capable of doing some function versus how many arrangements are there going to be that will leave you with gibberish sequences. And he used a very systematic sampling technique called site-directed mutagenesis, and he came up with a really precise estimate, which is for every protein that's functional, there are 10 to the 77th combinations that are not. And this is both in the origin of life context and in the context of biological evolution, a prohibitively small ratio. It suggests that random searches are going to fail for much the same reason that my hypothetical thief is going to fail in opening the 10-dial lock. There's not enough time to search but a tiny fraction of the total. And I go into the math of this in both books, in an origin of life context and in a biological evolution context. But for example, in the origin of life context, it turns out that if every event in the history of life in the history of the universe, where an event is defined as an interaction between elementary particles. And we can calculate the total number of such events that could occur, knowing how many elementary particles there are and how fast elementary particles can interact and so forth. So the bottom line ends up being that if every event in the history of the universe were dedicated to searching the combinatorial space of possible amino acid connections, we would only search 1/10 trillion trillionth of the total number of possible combinations. So it's like the thief that has to search the 10-dial lock and only has 100 years, only much, much worse. We're going to search a tiny, tiny portion of the space, meaning we're much more likely to fail by chance than succeed. Okay, and so the chance hypothesis becomes overwhelmingly more likely to be false than true. Now, of course, that's only one of Monod's possible approaches to explaining the origin of information. Another approach, and that's the 77-dial lock there. Another approach is to combine chance with some sort of law-like process, like natural selection. And in an origin of life context, this is the idea of prebiotic natural selection. Okay, and so in this case, we say, well, maybe natural selection could be operating to kind of winnow those chance events and move the chance events in some kind of preferred direction. Problem, though, is that natural selection is a process that that presupposes the ability of organisms to copy themselves, thus producing offspring who can compete for survival in some kind of process of differential reproduction. But self-replication in all living organisms depends upon information-rich DNA molecules and information-rich protein molecules. What are origin of life biologists trying to explain? The origin of the information in those molecules. So you can't invoke a process to explain the origin of the information in DNA and proteins if that process presupposes that those molecules already exist and requires them to exist for that process to operate. This is a classic form of begging the question. And so the whole approach of prebiotic natural selection has also run into a formidable conceptual problem. People have tried to solve this by making the self-replicators not whole organisms, but instead RNA molecules that perform some enzymatic functions and can also store information. And the thought was that they could do what both DNA and proteins do to kind of get around a famous chicken and egg problem. Turns out, however, that even in what are called ribozyme engineering experiments, where intelligent agents are building RNA molecules in hopes to get them to copy themselves, to kind of get a self-replication process going that would mimic what takes place in nature. The only way to do that is for the ribozyme engineer to carefully sequence the RNA molecule to give it the right sequence of informational bases, like on the DNA molecule, very similar. And the best we've been able to do is to get an RNA molecule that can copy about 10% of itself. But only then if there's pre-existing information provided, and if the information is provided by an intelligence. So these experiments, which are thought to simulate the origin of life on the early Earth and how it might have come from an RNA world, actually inadvertently end up simulating the need for intelligence to generate information, a key idea of the theory of intelligent design. One famous origin of life researcher, Christian de Duve, a Nobel laureate in this area, says the theories of prebiotic natural selection fail because they need information, which implies they have to presuppose what is to be explained in the first place. Okay. Last approach, and then I'll summarize my argument and we'll open it up. The last approach to explaining the origin of life was the necessity approach of Jacques Monod. He said chance, necessity, or the combination of the two. The third approach was what's called pure necessity, where you rely on some underlying laws of physics or chemistry to do the sequencing of the bases in the DNA or in the RNA that constitutes the information that needs to be explained. You might remember basic chemistry. If you've got Na and Cl, one has a plus charge, one has a minus charge, you put them together in an aqueous solution, and then the water comes off, you get a nice, beautiful crystal, right? And the structure of that is beautifully ordered, NaCl, 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 and it's all determined by the bonding affinities between the two elements. Okay? The chemistry determines the sequencing, and you get beautiful order. So in the late 1960s and 70s, there were scientists who thought that we might be able to explain the origin of these information-rich sequencing in proteins and DNA by reference to similar kind of chemical affinities in the constituent parts. That didn't work out in protein. It showed some promise in proteins, but it didn't work out empirically, and I won't go into the details. In DNA, there was an even more fundamental problem, and you can see that if you look at the structure of the DNA molecule, the structural formula for the DNA molecule on the screen behind me. You see the sugar phosphate backbones on each side, the outside of the molecule. That's the medium upon which the genetic message is inscribed, if you will. On the inside, in the longitudinal axis, you see the A's, C's, G's, and T's are labeled, representing those 4 nucleotide bases that are the 4 chemical letters in the genetic text. Now notice also that in that picture, you have little sticks representing bonds, or dotted lines representing chemical bonds. Notice in the longitudinal axis, the up-down axis there, the bases have no sticks between them. There is no chemical interaction between the bases in the way there is like with NaCl or a crystal. So there's no chemical forces of attraction that are determining their sequencing. To amplify that point, notice also that there are sticks connecting the sugar phosphate backbone to each of the 4 individual bases. Now, it turns out that that bond, represented by that stick, is the same kind of bond in each case. It's called an N-glycosidic bond. And that bond, that connecting bond, allows any one of the 4 bases to attach to the sugar phosphate backbone at any given site. In other words, there's nothing in the chemistry that discriminates the attractiveness of any bond to any place, so that the chemistry, again, is not determining the sequencing in the molecule. Now, this was first pointed out by the brilliant Hungarian physical chemist who was referred to in Professor Buchanan's talk, Michael Polanyi, in an article called Life Transcending Physics and Chemistry. And he said, we can understand the function of DNA, we can understand the function of life by reference to chemical processes and chemical laws. But we can't explain its origin that way, because the sequencing that provides the information for all biological function is not determined by the underlying chemistry. Now, in case all this talk about N-glycosidic bonds and stuff isn't quite sinking in, let's come out with another children's story, if you don't mind. I was yesterday at Intel. I didn't think that I was going to be doing this exact talk here, so I didn't come up with something to pander to this audience. But I could have said GCU rocks, okay? This is a magnetic chalkboard, and by analogy, this is the medium upon which a message has been inscribed. There are forces of attraction in these little magnets that explain how the message got attached to the backboard, okay? So that's all so far so good. The chemistry, or in this case the physics of magnetism, explains the attachment. But does it explain the sequential arrangement of the letters that cause them to convey a message or perform a communication function? Does it explain the information content of the characters here? Well, I think I would argue and can demonstrate that it does not, because see, I can very quickly, with all the same physical forces in play, completely destroy the message, okay? So the magnetism is not the difference that makes a difference. What was the source of the information in the message that was there a minute ago? Well, it was the quasi-intelligent design of the lecturer. Okay, so not too much intelligence there, but a little bit. Okay, so this has been this approach called the self-organizational scenarios has been the kind of cutting-edge approach in origin of life research, but it's also come to an impasse because it can't explain the information that's present in DNA by reference to underlying forces of physics and chemistry. The information transcends the physics and the chemistry that's involved in the molecule, and you can actually see that in the structure of the structural formula of the DNA molecule. It's fascinating. It's a true information carrying molecule. This isn't brute chemistry at work here. There's something else going on. Now, you can also think about what would happen if it were the case that chemistry were responsible for the arrangement of the characters. Then you'd have something like a crystal of salt where you have the same things repeating over and over again. Imagine you had an A and you had to get a G. And then I'm talking about the nucleotide bases. And then that G attracted another A to it. And then that A gave you a G. And then that A, well, then you get something like aga, 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 aga. You get a mantra, not a message. Information is not rigidly repeating. In information science or information theory, something that rigidly repeats is defined as redundancy. It's the same thing over and over again. All truly informational sequences have an aperiodicity to them, something non-repetitive. If you open your textbook and all you get is there's the only information content is in the first word. The rest of it is redundant, repetitive. So the underlying laws of physics and chemistry have not and cannot explain the origin of information. And that's a really profound point that's come out of this study of in origin of life biology. Now, yesterday I explained a bit about my own story of how I came to the idea that the design hypothesis could be formulated as a rigorous positive argument, a rigorous positive scientific argument using a method known as inference to the best explanation, a method that I first learned about by studying Darwin's own work, and the method of multiple competing hypotheses. And I don't know that I put up all these little figures yesterday, but the idea of multiple competing hypotheses, again, is you propose a number of different possible causes for a given effect, or in this case, a given historical event, and then you elect that cause which, if true, would best explain the events in question. Now, I love Professor Buchanan's talk about this, the scientific method, and some of the things that he was hinting at in the Q&A, because what he was describing is that there's two different contexts of science. There's the science of how things function, which is what most bench science is about. But then there's also a science of how things got here, which is an historical or forensic science. So I tend to think that there is, yes, a scientific method, the standard scientific method, but there are also other scientific methods. There's methods that are appropriate to the classificatory sciences. There are methods that are appropriate to the historical and forensic sciences. There are some types of science that test ideas by making predictions under controlled conditions in the lab. There are other kinds of sciences that test different hypotheses by reference to their explanatory power of facts vis-a-vis facts we already have. Sometimes those sciences also make predictions, sometimes they don't. So there is a standard scientific method, but there's also a variety of methods. And what's going on with these origins questions is the use of an historical scientific method. And in making my historical scientific case for intelligent design, I've used the very method of Darwin and Lyell and the historical scientists. And I mentioned last night that the key criterion by which we determine which of a group of competing hypotheses is best is the one that cites a cause now in operation. And then I went on to argue that intelligence or mind or conscious activity is the one cause of which we know that does produce digital code, digital information, which is the key thing that needs to be explained at the foundation of life. And so I talked about our famous Bill Gates, who says that the that DNA is like a software program, but much more complex than any we've ever created. Of course, he uses programmers to create software at Microsoft, and what we know from experience is that information in a digital form or in an alphabetic form always comes from an intelligent source. And so in the case I developed more formally in the signature in the cell, used this method of multiple competing hypotheses, and I took Monod's categories, chance, necessity, the combination of the two, but I also included another one, creative intelligence or intelligent design, and said which of those four possible kinds of causes best explains the information we have in DNA at the foundation of life, based on what we know from uniform and repeated experience, which is the basis of all scientific reasoning and the basis of all reconstructions, historical reconstructions of the past using the historical scientific method. And there I argued that intelligent design is the only cause which is known to be sufficient to produce the key effect in question that is at the foundation of life. And so implicit in all this was not only an argument for intelligent design, but implicit in this was an argument that intelligent design is an appropriate scientific hypothesis of origins, for the origin of life. Once we understand the character of historical scientific reasoning, then we can say, yeah, intelligent design is a scientific hypothesis. It's an historical or forensic scientific hypothesis, but it's using a method that's appropriate to the subject that's being investigated. And because I'm using Darwin's own method, it's if you want to say that intelligent design isn't science, you'd have to say that Darwinism or chemical evolutionary theory is also not scientific. So anyway, that's a summary of my case. There's other cool design patterns in living systems that I think also are uniquely explained by intelligent agency. We can talk about that or anything else you like in the time we have left. And I've tried to keep this somewhat brief, so we do have time to open it up for all comers on any subject, intelligent design, or miracles, or apologetics, or epistemology, or anything that's on your minds.
Could you speak to the issue that's sometimes brought up of methodological naturalism and how it interfaces with intelligent science? Also, as well as I think we heard last night that from Professor Harden that intelligent design generates no new hypotheses. It's not a fruitful endeavor, and so that sort of
predictions.
Yes.
Yeah. Would you mind ever so much bringing the slides back up? The pictures of me from 20 years ago is very flattering and everything, but I didn't plant this question, but it's the question I would have most wanted to address next. Would it be possible to get the slides back up that I just had? There we go. Thank you. Okay. If you look, the question, methodological naturalism is an excellent question, and it's so crucial to what folks are doing at a Christian university or Christian scholarship generally. Methodological naturalism is the idea that if we're going to be scientists or even scholars, we have to limit ourselves to explanations that are rendered in terms of strictly natural or materialistic processes, chance, necessity, and the combination of the two. Part of what we're doing with intelligent design is challenging that principle. It becomes very difficult to do any meaningful faith-learning integration if you have to view the world as if God did not exist. But in the area of origins, if you look at the inference that I just made, I looked at 4 competing hypotheses. Methodological naturalism would say that the idea of creative intelligence or mind it cannot be considered as a possible explanation. And so, but there's a problem with that, and that is that it limits the intellectual freedom of the scientist to follow the evidence wherever it might lead, based on what we know about cause and effect. If I walk in, and I used this example last night, walking into the British Museum, I look at the Rosetta Stone. If I'm committed to methodological naturalism, and I see the informational inscriptions on the rock, I can't infer that a scribe did it. I would have to say, well, it was wind and erosion, okay, or chemical etching or something that was purely material. And because there are certain types of effects that we know from our uniform and repeated experience only arise from intelligence, then we need to be open to inferring intelligence when we encounter those kinds of effects. And so what intelligent design is doing is not only making a case for intelligent design, it's arguing for an open philosophy of science rather than one that's artificially restricted by methodological naturalism. Methodological naturalism is a definition of science that prevents certain types of inferences from being considered, even if there's strong evidence for those inferences. So we're trying to open things up. And a couple other things that could be said about methodological naturalism is that very often, and this gets to the whole issue, is intelligent design science? I'm far less concerned with the answer to that question than I am to another question, which is intelligent design true or probably true or likely to be the best explanation, which is a probable indicator of truth. We've gotten really hung up on the definitional question of how do you define science, and we try to win arguments by saying, well, that guy's not a science, that's not science, okay? And I think it's a bit of a red herring. I think intelligent design, because it's using the same method that other historical scientists do, and was the case was built self-consciously around using those methods, that it is properly classified as an historical scientific theory. But if you don't like that, if you want to call it a metaphysical hypothesis or a natural theological hypothesis or something else, I don't really care, because all that's just semantics. What we really want to know is what's true about nature, where did it come from, and what's our best explanation for that. So a lot more to say on it, but methodological naturalism is something that I think prevents genuine integration, where we think that divine action may have played a role in the world in the past, maybe in the present, maybe it's, for example, underlying what we call the laws of nature. We need to be more, to get a robust theology of nature and natural theology, we need to be open to the idea that God has played a bigger role in reality than methodological naturalism will allow. Yeah.
Thank you for your talk. I wanted to ask a question. I mean, the example you gave of the bike clock is an example I hear frequently.
The example of, sorry,
of the bike clock, the bicycle lock.
Oh, the bike clock, yes. Oh, sorry, okay.
All right. And the reason I puzzle over that example, and the reason I'm not sure that it's appropriate is one that hopefully I can take advantage of the physics background that we share. If I'm going to assemble proteins, let me take the example of Axe. I mean, I guess I could have taken others, but Dr. Axe's example of functional proteins. If I'm going to put these amino acids together, I'm going to be doing a quantum mechanical calculation. I'm not going to be doing a classical calculation. And so the way I do quantum mechanics, the way I would do that is it would be a pain. It's going to take a long time, but I'm going to have to write down 10 to the 77th, if that's how many configurations there are. I'm going to have to write down 10 to the 77th diagrams, and that's going to be the quantum mechanical calculation I've got to solve. Now, I'll write down those 10 to the 77th terms. I will throw them into Schrodinger's equation or whatever, and I will produce then the probabilities of these things that are going to happen. So I do that single quantum mechanical calculation. Now, what's going to happen is going to be determined by the probabilities that arise then once I've done this enormous calculation. Things are going to have a higher probability if a particular conformation minimizes the energy more or whatever. There's going to be all kinds of things going in it. It's like the protein folding problem for that matter. But the bottom line is the calculation includes all 10 to the 77th. I turn the crank one time, I get those probabilities. And the thing that is most probable is the thing that's most likely to happen. And so, I think the thing that troubles me about the bicycle lock thing is the idea that I'm going to try each of these things one at a time. Quantum mechanically, I sample the entire configuration space and go from there. And so I don't see quite how the bicycle lock, and for that matter, Dr. Axe, I mean, I have no doubt he's an incredible molecular biologist or physical chemist or whatever you want to call him. But that is the way the calculation is done. It's not done one term at a time. The whole calculation, I have to write down all of the diagrams. And again, I admit it's hard. Nobody could do it probably.
Well, that's part of the problem.
A human couldn't do it. But the calculation includes those automatically.
Well, I think the bike lock example involves a person doing something incrementally through time, okay? But the probabilities involved are time independent. I don't really see how quantum mechanics plays a role in this because the peptides and the amino acids are large units. We're not dealing with quantum mechanical effects.
Worry about decoherence or
yeah, so in any case, I mean, the bottom line is that no one in origin of life research is any longer pursuing a chance-based approach because of the prohibitive odds we're looking at. The combinatorial spaces are so vast that they dwarf the number of events that you have in the history of the universe. So whether you make the calculations assuming that you get to do the search incrementally over time, or whether you're just going to sort of mathematically survey the landscape of possibilities against the totality of the search space in the mathematical way you describe, the numerator ends up being incredibly tiny, the denominator immense, and the allowable time to do the search is very limited. So I just don't think this is a contentious point, and I don't think quantum mechanics really, an appeal to quantum mechanics changes that. But maybe I'm missing something, so maybe we can take this offline and discuss. Yeah. Right here, yes, Mr. Puma. Oh, Miss, sorry. I can hardly see anything up here. Sorry.
No, that's okay. So my thought process here is we've got carbon dating that tells us our Earth is millions and millions of years old versus the young Earth theory that says we're, roughly 3,000 to 4,000 years old. I was just curious to what your stance is on that.
Right. Intelligent design is not engaging that question, as you can see, although for most of us it presupposes the great antiquity of the universe and the Earth. I mean, in all the arguments, I'm an old Earth guy in my perspective, but I also have the view that humans, anatomically modern humans with our cognitive capacity, are fairly recent. There's something in evolutionary biology called the Big Bang of human cultural evolution, and it's on the order of tens of thousands, not millions of years. Okay, so I think my own view on that is that the archaeological record, as well as the anthropological record of the bones and things, is highly relevant to figuring out where we came on the scene. And the oldest cities on Earth one was Jericho. Now there's probably a Turkish city that was buried under the Black Sea that might be 10 or 12,000 years old. We've got writing only since the Sumerians. We have agriculture only since the last ice age. We have cave paintings going back a bit before that. That's representational art. But there's not a whole lot beyond that. So I'm not exactly sure where we first come on the scenes, but I don't think it was even 2 million years ago with Homo erectus or whatever. So for people who are biblically troubled by this question, let me offer something, because this is another point of common ground that Professor Hardin and I have. I don't think the Bible teaches a young Earth. And for me, the reason, I don't know what Jeff's thinking on that is, but for me, a decisive piece of information hermeneutically is the description in day 4 of the creation account. Because there it's told that God either created or caused to appear, depending on how you render a Hebrew word hayah. Okay, but what's mentioned is the sun and the moon, and we're told that they were given as markers of the days, the years, and the seasons. They're time markers. But the days of creation, the yoms, have already been established. We've had 3 of them already, with no time markers that would allow us to determine the length of time of a day of creation using our human denominated time markers. So I think we have to be very careful not to impose too much meaning on those, an anthropomorphic modern meaning on those terms, when the Bible's giving us a very important clue that maybe the time involved is not the same, it's not our time. We couldn't possibly have measured it when those days of creation were established. So I've always looked to other evidence to establish age questions. I'm very persuaded that the universe is very, very old, based on the light that's coming from the distant galaxies and many other things. I don't see any reason really to question radiometric dating unless there's contamination in samples, which does happen, but I think overall it's a very good method, and geologically I've got a lot of other reasons. So I've always found the science for an old Earth, old universe compelling, but I do hold the view that humans, this Big Bang of human cultural evolution was a very significant event, and I think it was fairly recent. And so I have sort of a hybrid position. Having said all that, there are people in the ID camp that hold a variety of different views on this, because we're mainly concerned with the question, is design real or illusory? That's the issue we're engaging. And so we haven't made an issue of that among the people that are interested in design. I actually have a young Earth colleague, Paul Nelson, who is kind of a moderate young Earth guy. We tried to argue about it once, and we just got bored. Okay, so I say that partly for the benefit of the church. I think it's become a toxic issue in the church. We've made way too much of it, and we need to extend to each other a lot more grace on this issue. There are sincerely held people, sincerely held hermeneutics of people on both sides of this issue about how you read Genesis, and I think it's an important issue because it's always important to understand what the Bible really means, but we need to give people grace and respect as they think about these issues differently. And that's one of the reasons it was so fun for me last night to talk to Jeff, because we obviously we got some other differences, but I thought that was a very constructive and congenial conversation, and I thank the GCU people for setting that up in the way they did, because I think that was very constructive. Yeah. Thank you for the good question. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for your talks. They were really great.
Well, thank
I'm
you.
a protein NMR biophysicist.
You are the biophysicist? Yes.
Yeah. Well, yes.
I think that's the most awesome of all fields, to bring the physics and the biology together like that.
There's chemistry in there too. They trick me.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
But I had a theological question.
I tried to get my son to major in that, and he didn't like the physics part. He just did straight biology. So.
Sure. Yeah. I'm more on the bio side anyway.
Are you? Okay.
But I did have a quick comment on the dynamics of proteins and how quantum mechanics can come in. When you do NMR, you use a lot of how do I say this? Okay, let me put it this way. You have spin dynamics at play, and you use that and magnetic moments to determine how proteins can breathe. So a lot of the models that we have are static pictures instead of the moving movies.
Right, they're dynamic systems, right? That's what makes them so exciting.
Yeah, exactly. And so even if
when I was at Intel yesterday, they had a lot of hardware engineers, and I'm used to talking more to software people because we got Redmond and Microsoft and in Seattle.
Right.
And but I said there's hardware in the cell that processes information, but it's also hardware, it's wetware because it's dynamic, and ribosomes and polymerases, and they adapt their shape in real time to the substrates. And anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, so I just wanted to comment quickly that I think quantum mechanics and protein folding are very much in tune.
Yeah.
And in fact, they add to the intelligent design theory in that it's hard to predict dynamics. We can come up with entropic equations.
Maybe that's what the gentleman was getting at before, because there's a
order parameter.
Well, see, what I wonder about that then is I think there's almost an incompleteness problem that you face that makes any probabilistic calculations even worse.
Right.
Not better. I don't think taking into account the dynamical aspect. I think I may get what he was getting at then, because it is simplistic to think of a biclock because that's a static mechanical system, and as going all the way back to Kant, who talked about the difference between a mechanical and organic unity. He said in a mechanical unity, every part is cause of something else in a very deterministic way. But in an organic unity, every part is both cause and effect of something else.
Right.
And that's what creates this potential for an NP incompleteness as we try to solve things like the protein folding problem.
Exactly.
So, yeah, okay. Yeah,
that's a quick
I see what I think you were getting at now, and that is right then. My illustration is too simplistic, but it's simplistic in a way that adds weight to my argument, not subtracts. Yeah.
At least that's what
That's what you would say. Okay, all right. Maybe we can discuss it afterwards.
Yeah.
Okay.
Anyway,
and you have a Bible verse. Excellent.
I was an atheist until 6 years ago, and I'm trying to understand. Yeah, praise God. Yeah. Right. I was saying God was dead and everything, and then I met Jesus, and then I started reading the Bible. It's been amazing since then, a hard life indeed. But the verse that always struck me was Genesis 3:22. And the Lord God said, "Behold, the man is become as one of us to know good and evil, and now lest he put forth his hand and take also of the tree of life and eat and live forever." I think of Genesis 1 where God created everything and said it was good, and then Genesis 2 where he warned Adam not to eat of the tree of life unless he dies. And then in Romans it says, death entered the world through one man and sin entered as well. I think I'm flipping the two. But in the light of all those verses, I'm trying to understand and fathom, did death exist before Adam and Eve partook of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil? And where does the tree of life come in? Were we immortal before? Or were we given the chance to be immortal before we ate of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil? And then all of a sudden God's like, hey, actually now the chance is gone because you can't access the tree of life?
Well, your second question is probably above my pay grade. It'd be a good one for a good Bible scholar.
Right,
okay.
Sorry, yeah.
The one about death is interesting because it does intersect these issues of origins, because there are different models of what are called theodicy. How does natural evil enter the world? And there's different views on this. Our young earth friends say that all animal death entered the world when Adam and Eve fell. that's what's called a young Earth theodicy, okay, a young Earth account of nature. Darwinians will sometimes refer to nature as nature red tooth and claw, that fierce competitive aspect that is involved in the survival instinct. But I took a favorable note of what Jeff pointed out yesterday with the psalm that talked about the lion, that God gives the lion as prey. There's a physicist from Pitt, and now I think he may have gone on to Baylor. His name is David Snoke, who's a PCA layman who's written a very thoughtful little book on the problem of natural evil. And he divides it into different categories of things. There's claims of bad design, and I mentioned last night, a lot of claims of bad design are really weak. The God wouldn't have done it that way argument that doesn't take into account the what I called constrained optimization, or what Jeff was talking about with trade-offs. I don't think those are very formidable objections. But there are other things where we see evidence of decay. Like I have a colleague, Scott Minnick, who's a microbiologist, and he specializes in virulence, and he says that it's virtually gospel now in his field that all forms of virulence are the result of degradation of prior aboriginal information, usually by mutation. And he's done a study of the plague bacterium, which is one of the nastiest forms of natural evil ever, and it's actually the result of 4 discernible mutations that, remember that little bacterial flagellar motor I showed? Yeah, well, if the successive mutations in that turned the motor into something that could secrete toxic proteins. And that's the mechanism of the plague. So it's clearly an evidence of a degradation of an aboriginal design. Now, your question is, well, did that happen before the fall of Adam or after? The older theodicy tends to see there as being that there was a natural order that involved animal death before Adam and Eve, and some even say maybe that was the result of the prior fall of the angelic beings, and theologians have speculated on this, but there's a number of good books on this with different perspectives, old Earth and young Earth theodicies, and I can't really answer all the questions, but the old Earth people tend to think there was either a fall or a natural ecosystem that involved animal death beforehand, and then things got a lot worse after Adam and Eve failed to exercise proper stewardship and dominion. The young Earth people tend to think that all that happened at the fall in the garden. So those are the 2 views, basically. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Oh.
Dr. I'm Rick. In our meetup discussion group, we're extremely pragmatic from the standpoint of, well, it's fun to discuss a lot of this stuff, okay, as far as intelligent design, et cetera. We see it as an apologetics tool toward evangelism, obviously. That's really what we're here for as Christians, okay? So what I'm seeing is a lot of the guys, not so much in Gen Z, but Gen X, millennials, whatever.
I get all those mixed up, but anyway, go ahead.
So do they, okay.
Yeah.
Because Gen Z right now is at a point, because you learn a lot about life when you're in your college years. That's where a lot of it's set. But they head down the path, the multiverse path, okay? And if you get to Gen Y, X, millennials, et cetera, they're at a point now that because they're beyond their college years, they don't understand that they're running into significant barriers with this multiverse argument. They don't understand it. Gen Zers do understand. They might not understand the argument, but they understand that there's barriers there. Okay, so I look at our group and say the massive belief we have is we don't need to completely comprehensively completely dismiss and prove all the values on our side. We just need to show that the likelihood of intelligent design versus this chance thing is the better option of the 2. Okay?
Right.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, a couple things. It's important in framing arguments for design, I think, to recognize that the naturalistic side doesn't rely solely on chance. That's one of the things they fault us for as far as making a straw man argument. And you can see it just on the little screen still behind me is there are multiple modalities of naturalistic explanation, and to make a persuasive case for design, we need to engage them all and argue that ID is best, or theism is best, in contrast to multiple competing hypotheses. But the multiverse, well, the Gen Zs and Gen X thing, one thing I often hear is that, well, that younger generation, however they're defined, isn't interested in apologetics. They're not interested in reasons for faith. And I taught at the college level for 12 years and have continued to teach a course from time to time on college campuses that I called Reasons for Faith. And I found quite to the contrary of what was always said. In the Gen X, Gen Z, whatever, millennials, they're only interested, they're postmodern, so they're not interested in rational arguments. They're only interested in how stuff feels to them and their personal experience and narrative and story. I found that to be quite false. That when you offer a compelling case for the biblical faith, whether it's a presuppositional argument or whether it's the kind of argument I made last night or whether it's an argument for the historical reliability of the Bible, and there are many good such arguments, people are immediately interested. I think what we have failed to do is provide answers to deep, unspoken metaphysical and worldview questions. And in the absence of that, people then become fideistic and often lose their faith once they are confronted with a rational challenge to their Christian faith in the university years. John Lennox, a friend and colleague and someone many of you may know from his fantastic YouTube presentations, the Oxford professor of math and philosophy, says, we're losing our young people because we're not answering their questions. So I'm not a rationalist. I think there are limits to human reason, but I believe that reason is part of our imago Dei. It's built into us, and if we don't give people for a reason for the hope that is within us, they won't have the hope either. So you asked, though, about the multiverse. I have a lot on that in my new book. In addition to the argument I made last, I think there's the take among physicists is that theistic design, and the multiverse are basically a wash. That they're both faith commitments. You can't really tell from the physics itself. It could be either one. In my new book, I argue that there's very strong reasons to prefer theistic design over the multiverse hypothesis, one of which is that all multiverse hypotheses depend on various speculative cosmologies that require universe-generating mechanisms that themselves require exquisite, prior, unexplained fine-tuning. So the fine-tuning is ultimately not explained on a multiverse hypothesis, whereas we know of a cause that produces fine-tuned systems, and that's fine-tuners, minds. But in addition, the multiverse hypothesis is vastly more complicated in the Occam sense of lacking parsimony. It's not just all the other universes you have to posit, it's all the purely hypothetical entities that have to be postulated. Just within string theory, you have strings, you have the string theoretic landscape, you have the idea that every solution to the string theoretic equations somehow mysteriously corresponds to another universe in which there are separate laws of physics and chemistry. In the inflationary cosmology, you have to believe in things called inflaton fields and precisely tuned inflaton shutoff energies. And you add up all these, there's over a dozen pure hypothetical postulates between these two speculative cosmologies that you have to affirm in order to explain the thing that the one postulate of a transcendent, intelligent God explains. So I think, and this is a point Richard Swinburne and others have made in philosophy, I developed it a bit more in the book. So I think there's a number of really good epistemological reasons to favor the one God hypothesis over the many universes. And I don't know if that helps in your interactions with young people, but it will be in chapter 16 of Return of the God Hypothesis. So look for it. Yes, hello.
Hi, Dr. Meyer.
Hi, Beatrice.
How are
From
you?
Intel, or well,
Yes.
used to be at Intel, yeah.
Yes, so thank you for coming to Intel yesterday. It was really awesome hearing your talk there and today and yesterday. So one just quick comment. I had the same question that the young lady had. It's a theological question. I mean, from a theological perspective, there's an old Hebrew scholar called Michael Heiser, and he wrote 2 books, The Supernatural and In the Unseen Realm, and he addresses those specific questions myself. I've asked myself
excellent.
those.
So a good source. Yeah.
I found it helpful. So on getting to my question here, so a lot of the arguments, I hear all kinds of arguments against design, but one of them is that you're kind of making more of the negative case for design in the sense that you're explaining away what maybe, against the Darwinian evolution per se, but what would be more or less the positive case. And I'm thinking of some of the work that Brian Miller is doing with some of the, engineering
the systems biology.
The systems, maybe that's one of the arguments, but how would you approach that?
Let me in a couple of ways, and thank you for asking that. I think people don't adequately appreciate the nature of this historical scientific method that I've been describing. And that plays out in a couple of different ways. But if the key test of a good hypothesis about what caused an event to happen in the past is the test of causal adequacy, then what needs to be provided in any case for any given hypothesis is evidence of the causal adequacy of the type of cause that's being posited. And in the latter part of both of my big books on design in biology, I provide extensive examples of the role of conscious agency in producing information. That's something that we know from our experience. We have lots of examples of it. Many of them come from our ordinary experience, not from our laboratory experience. So to scientific sensibilities, it seems like, well, that's sort of commonsensical maybe, but it's not a scientific argument. But I want to argue that it is, because scientia is what we know. It's knowledge, okay? And we know that minds produce code. We know of no other cause that does that. We've encountered code at the foundation of life. That ought to trigger something. That ought to awaken us to a possible hypothesis. Now, but in addition to our ordinary experience of information in a radio signal or a hieroglyphic inscription or a paragraph in a book or the things that I mentioned in the lecture last night, we also have this curious thing that's happening in simulation experiments, for example, in origin of life biology, where people are trying to move the chemistry in a life-friendly direction, but they invariably, in order to do that, have to apply their own intelligence to constrain chemical possibilities to move in a direction that the chemistry doesn't want to go in on its own. This is one of the big points of Jim Tour in his fantastic internet lectures and his articles that he's been writing about the origin of life, the Rice organic chemist. To get anywhere in a life-friendly or life-tropic direction, you have to use already purified materials. You have to introduce them at the right time, in the right measures, under the right temperatures, and then you have to remove byproducts that you don't want to prevent interfering cross reactions. And every time you're excluding one option chemically and electing another, what are you doing? In information theoretic terms, you're imparting information. Where's the information coming from? It's coming from the experimenter. Now, the whole logic of simulation experiments as they were formulated in origin of life research is that what we do and discover in the lab, the causes of the chemistry moving in the right direction in the lab are the ones that we can posit plausibly as having taken place in the past, because the present is the key to the past. This is Lyell's dictum. This is uniformitarianism. But if you can't eliminate mind from any movement towards success, and if the mind is always inputting information, then I would argue that these simulation experiments are also providing additional positive evidence for the causal adequacy of intelligent design as the best explanation for the information. Go ahead. Oh, well, I have one more thing to add to that. Yeah. Well, okay, that's one part of a research program, is explaining facts that we already know exist. We have to explain the origin of the code. But intelligent design, like a mature research program, is now generating a number of very interesting predictions. And those predictions have to do with what the foundation of the predictions is, again, our knowledge of cause and effect of what agents do, especially what they do in relation to information processing systems or informational architectures. So on the screen, I have a list of design patterns that were presented to me by a Microsoft engineer, an architect-level programmer at Microsoft, who wrote a bunch of code for us to help us simulate the gene expression system in Doug Axe's Stylus program, if you're familiar with that. And what this programmer did one day is he came into my office, he threw this book down on my desk, and it said, "I get an eerie feeling someone has figured this out before us." And I said, by what do you mean by it? He says, the gene expression system that I'm simulating. Because he said, you go on and on, Steve, about the brute fact of digital code in DNA, but it's far beyond that. Because what I'm seeing, and then he explained to me what a design pattern was in computer science. It's a recognized process for storing or processing digital information. And he said, this system is screaming of all these design patterns, automated error correction. He says, you got a spell check in your computer, there's automated error correction in the cell. You've got hierarchical filing, you've got a hierarchical information storage systems in the cell. And he went down this list, distributed storage and retrieval of informational modules, where, it's not that all the genetic information for building a particular protein or regulatory RNA is now stored in one place. There's a better way to do it. You store parts of it in places, and then you go out and find the stuff you need and concatenate it. We do that in the computer world. All these sophisticated design patterns present in digital code, and we know of only one cause for those sorts of things. Again, it's intelligence. So that provides additional evidential support for the explanatory power of design, but it also allows us to go out and look. When we know of design patterns, and we know what intelligent agents do when they're using informational systems, it suggests reasons to go look for design patterns that we might not have found. One of our scientists in Germany came to me a few years ago and said, I have an ID-based hypothesis. I think we might, one way of enhancing the storage density of information is to layer information, is to have overlapping messages. You do this in cryptography. And he said, so I'm going to use ID to go as a basis for predicting that we might have overlapping genes. He's now found overlapping genes in all 6 reading reference frames, 3 going forward and then 3 in the antisense directions in the bacterial chromosome. And some of his postdocs didn't believe this was possible, But when you think about trying to satisfy all those informational constraints by an undirected mutation selection process, it's mind-boggling. But an intelligent agent could do that, so we've been predicting that junk DNA would have function. It has turned out exactly to have that. We've been predicting overlapping genes. We've been predicting the ubiquity of orphan genes. There's a whole lot of things because we know how intelligent agents use information and what should exist if the informational properties of life were designed as opposed to having arisen through a mutation selection process. There's a whole lot of things that ought to exist in nature on one hypothesis and not on the other. So ID is actually becoming a very mature research program in the sense that it's not only explaining things we already know, it's predicting things and providing new research programs, new testable research hypotheses as well.
It would be interesting to actually spend more time on trying to understand how the origin of life from that perspective, because Darwin tried to explain it and say, well, here's how you get from zero to everything, right? And so what I think ideas you're working on developing is still, okay, it seems like we need some sort of design. I mean, we need a mind. We need someone to intervene to create these systems that are incredibly complex. And I'm very familiar since I'm an engineer myself. And so it's like now the question is getting to how can we maybe continue to mature this and understand more of the process. How do we get from zero to the first cell, from the first cell to the first organism, from the first organism to another species, and so on and so forth. I know if we're ever gonna, Darwinian is offering that, but
that's exactly the right approach. And because we know something about what minds do, in particular with respect to information technology, but with respect to other technologies. We were talking about the automobile in an earlier talk, and there's this interesting sort of groups within groups pattern that arises in the history of human technology, where you get an initial theme, and then you get a variation on that theme within the architectural structure of the bow plan. And in Darwin's Doubt, I show how the pattern in the fossil record is actually strangely reminiscent to the pattern of our own history of technology. So because we know what minds do, and we can, in many cases, contrast it to what natural selection and mutation or other evolutionary bottom-up mechanisms would do, it does, the two programs do generate some similar expectations, but many different ones. And those different ones allow for the possibility of, or they generate discriminating predictions that have implications for further research. And we're now in the phase of not only developing those, but funding many of those projects at Discovery Institute. And the project you mentioned on systems biology, with the biologists and the engineers cooperating, and in particular, we have a new engineer from the UK, Stuart Burgess, who's working with us, who's a specialist in biomimetics, which is looking at biological designs and then using those design strategies to solve engineering problems in the human world, which is another cool application of ID thinking. So,
the discussion can continue, but
okay.
Time is time.
Okay, very good. Yeah, maybe we'll take one more and then let people go. We were trying to be sensitive to time.
Hello, Dr. Meyer.
Another person I know, Eric.
Yes.
Great to see you.
Hello, thank you. Well, all these intellects and scientists, I'm going to dumb it down here a little bit because I'm neither. You talked about yesterday worldviews, and it also appears that everything that you're doing, you're trying to stay scientifically based in it. And, it's odd hearing Dr. Hardin talk about, you guys were discussing something, and again, so fast and so intellectual, a little over my head, but he did mention that, the bottom line was that it wasn't based in science, something that he was talking about. But it appears to me that everything that you're doing seems to be based in science. Based on your knowledge of the Bible and the way you speak, it also appears that you're a Christian.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
And yesterday, there was a question regarding, his philosophies and yours, and I believe he mentioned that, the intelligence is the Christian God. Where I've seen some of your talks and some of the things that you've talked about, and it appears that you are trying to stay more scientific. You call it an intelligent designer or mind, and it appears that you are referring that this is the Christian God, but staying very scientific. And I'm just wondering, does that have to do with the fact that, these worldviews that we have as a culture, like some of this Darwinist stuff and some of the other bad things that have been put in, but that the academia and the media, when proof against it or things come out that prove otherwise, they don't really highlight this. So I guess my question is that why you talk about the intelligent designer or the mind and keep it so scientific, so that at some point maybe there is a worldview or at least a scientific acceptance of what you're doing?
Yeah, it's a great question. This isn't, I suppose there's this isn't really a matter of strategy, okay? It's a matter of, first of all, I'm quite content to go beyond arguing for a mind of some kind. That's what I did in the first two books. In the biology, I had to be open to the possibility that the intelligence could be immanent or transcendent, because the evidence of design comes after the beginning of the universe, and there might have been something within the cosmos that preceded the origin of life on Earth, that an intelligent agent, it was at least a logical possibility. I made clear that wasn't the possibility I favored. I'm a theist, I'm a Christian theist, but in taking the approach of starting from the evidence and see what you can infer from it, I got, by looking at the biology, at least to the conclusion that a mind of some kind was responsible. What I did in last night's talk and what I'm doing in the new book is bringing in the cosmology and the physics to say that if we want to explain the whole ensemble of evidence, biological, physical, and cosmological, we need a transcendent form of intelligence, which is also, or who is also active in the creation. That now is a theistic concept of a creator, and that's the kind of God we encounter in the pages of Scripture. Now, to decide between different forms of theism, Jewish theism, Christian theism, Islamic theism, non-religious theism, I think it's very important to look at not just general revelation, but the special revelation of the Bible, because that's where God claims to be acting. The record of God's actions in history are claimed to be recorded, and I think by examining the scriptural text, you then have a way of examining the claims of Judaism and Christianity with respect to God's activity in history. So I think special revelation is indispensable to moving from a mere theism position, which is all I've really argued for in this conference, to a specifically biblical Christian position, which is the position I hold. Now, I think that too is not something that is only coming to that kind of a view is not something that forces one only to take a leap of faith, okay? I think you can encounter Christ through Scripture and through prayer, through the Holy Spirit, without having an apologetic argument for his existence. God has a way of getting to people however he wills, and many people come to faith in different ways. But it doesn't follow from that there aren't good arguments and good evidence for, say, the reliability of the Bible. And in courses that I've taught, I move from the case for intelligent design to the case for theism to the case for the reliability of the Bible, and eventually to what Lee Strobel calls the case for Christ. So I think apologetics is fantastically interesting and very powerful if it's done well. And we live in a time when there is an enormous amount of evidence supportive not only of the not only of the reality of God, but of biblical revelation as well. I was in Israel in the fall and went one day to the Israel Museum and saw the Pilate stone, the Caiaphas burial crypt, and then later that day, the place where Jesus stood trial before Pilate, which has recently been discovered, the first century Roman praetorium with a bema seat. And the historical evidence for the Gospels is stunning. I used to tell my students, you have no right to expect this level of corroboration for any document this old, and yet here it is, So I'm impressed by special revelation as well as general, and it's one reason that I'm a Christian, but not the only one. I also think the personal encounter with Jesus Christ is crucial to a Christian conversion. So it's, for me, it's a both and. There's an intellectual component and an experiential component of Christian faith, and I affirm both. But thank you that's a great question on which to end a really successful conference. So thank you. Yeah.